Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Big Tech's War on Free Speech. Please welcome the president of the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Kevin Roberts.
Thanks for that. You're very kind, and I'm glad you're all here and glad that many people have tuned in online. I get the great privilege of introducing two wonderful patriots of our age, and I'll do that momentarily. But just to frame today's conversation, ostensibly, it's about a really good book, a book that I just started reading this week and highly recommend it to you, not for the purposes of enriching the author at 7 cents a piece, but because it's a really good read, one that's both substantive and accessible. And that's important because the subject of that book, Big Tech, really is also about the First Amendment. And as a conservative for my entire life, someone who loves the free market, I understand the value of the free market, especially understanding that the free market, properly understood, is the outgrowth of a healthy society, a society that has healthy institutions like families and communities and virtuous businesses that also happen to love America. And so I highly recommend that book for you. And as you know, the Heritage Foundation this year has been leading the way among conservatives when it comes to pressuring Congress and state legislatures to take action against one of the enemies of free speech, and that's big tech. With that said, two of the people who are leading that very worthwhile fight are first, Kara Frederick, the Director of Tech Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. You may see Kara on a number of TV shows, hear her on the radio. She's always worth listening to and watching because of her precision when it comes to the solutions that need to happen. And obviously I'm biased because she's a colleague here at Heritage, but you'll enjoy her moderating of the conversation with our other guest, also a good friend, and that's Congressman Ken Buck from the great state of Colorado, the author of said book. Would you please join me in welcoming both of them to the stage?
So very, very interesting, I think, degree of scholarship, sir, that you brought to the big tech question. So everybody's talked about Twitter, the Twitter files, and we've talked about big tech, I think, just generally in our discourse for a long time. But I think Dr. Roberts talked very specifically about the idea of precision. And what I thought was very, very interesting about your take and your precise take on this is the free market aspect of it. And I found it fascinating. You did a podcast called The American Moment, and I listened to some of your responses about the free market because as conservatives, we are, allergic to anyone talking about the free market in less than glowing terms. But I would really like you to explain what you mean by the anti-competitive practices of these big tech companies and how they relate to what I would say is a warping of the free market. Because to me, that was the most convincing aspect of the fight against big tech and your particular take on it, which I really hadn't heard before.
Well, Kara, if I first can introduce my chief of staff, Zach, and Isabella and Joe, who are working on this issue and trying to convince our side of the aisle, now that we're in the majority, that we need to get some good things done. And I really appreciate all the work that the staff did, not in writing the book, ethics committee, not in writing the book, but in helping with the project for the last 3 or 4 years. It's really fascinating when you go back to what our founders had to say about monopolies. The East India Company was a monopoly, and they were so upset about how the East India Company was dominating the marketplace, and there were some illegal products here, but the British government basically said that tea is only to be sold by this one company, and so they were absolutely against monopolies, so much so that they had a conversation between Jefferson and Madison, and Madison said it's ridiculous to think in our country of freedom that we'll ever have a business monopoly. Little did they anticipate e-commerce and social media and issues like that. But I don't think you can have a free market for business without having a free marketplace of ideas. And that's where the two come together is really the issue for me. And that's why it's so important when we're talking about companies that disseminate information that we make sure that we have that free marketplace of ideas and we have competition in the business marketplace.
Now, the pushback that I've gotten, that I'm sure you've gotten, is many people will say, oh, Twitter, it doesn't even have the 3 billion users that say Facebook has. And if you don't want to be on Twitter, don't be on Twitter. What they're doing is not necessarily affecting political outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you and I know that to not be true, clearly, but what would you say to the people who are basically, frankly, poo-pooing the idea that these companies are so integral to how we speak as Americans, to our culture of free speech as Americans?
Yeah, I would say one word: Parler. They were able to take Parler down in a matter of a few days. There's plenty of evidence that federal law enforcement has accumulated that shows that Twitter was being used at the Capitol on January 6th, that Facebook was being used before January 6th. Parler wasn't unique in its position. They just decided it was a conservative competitor, and they wanted to take it out. And January 6th provided the perfect opportunity for Amazon Web Services and Apple and the others to just wipe them off the face of the earth. So how do you have free speech? How do you have competition in the marketplace when you've got 4 companies that are so big that they can wipe out any kind of competitor?
And that's how I kind of look at it. There's degrees of gradation here in common speak, but also in the tech world, we talk about the digital stack, where you have your application layer sitting on top of your mid-tier cloud hosting platforms, and then more foundational layers like ISPs, et cetera. And I think it is a matter of access, because you have, again, all your digital platforms, your Twitters, your Facebooks, et cetera, Amazon Web Services that you talked about, which it matters if they can pull access, Americans' ability to even see information. So sort of a degree of manifestation, like when Twitter was breaking links in the DMs to the Hunter Biden laptop story. So I think there's an access issue here that most people don't necessarily account for. That brings me to a new digital platform that I think is very interesting, TikTok. So we'll talk about fixes, legislative solutions, but also what the grassroots can do. But TikTok, what is your take on that platform, frankly, emanating out of China, ByteDance parent company? I'd like to hear your take on this new issue in big tech.
Well, so Senator Hawley had a bill in the Senate, and I had a bill in the House that prohibited TikTok from being used on government phones, because it is clearly a tool that the Communist Party in China is using to monitor U.S. behavior and individual U.S. data. President Trump issued an executive order that took care of that. And I think the Omni had some language in there. But TikTok is dangerous, not because of its competition in the marketplace. I think it's healthy in that sense. If Microsoft or some company had bought it, I'd be all in favor of that kind of competition for Facebook. But the bottom line is how it's being used by an adversary is dangerous and concerning.
Yep, I completely agree. You talked about competition in the marketplace. You and I had a phone call after we released our big tech paper, and you said, I read it, here's where I disagree with you. And I can't say you were wrong at this point, but you said you're talking about the consumer welfare standard. And our idea in the paper was, we have to clarify how the consumer welfare standard applies to zero price markets, because economists are, they're used to looking at things with that dollar sign, and, they live and die by the dollar sign on the x-axis, and, how it benefits consumer because of the money that they do or they don't have in their pockets. Tech is much different. It's definitely when people say, if you don't know what the product is, you are the product. If it's free, you're the product. So how would you look at the consumer welfare standard in this new environment with these big tech companies effectively giving their services away, but with an asterisk?
So it's a fascinating issue to me. If you look at sort of monopoly law generally, we Congress, before my time, believe it or not, in the 1800s, passed the Sherman Act, and then 1913, the Clayton Act, and then said to the courts, go figure this out. We're going to pass this general law. You apply these facts to our sense of what a monopoly is and competition should be. You go figure it out. And that was post-Industrial Revolution, or certainly during the Industrial Revolution. And then we had the new revolution of information. And so the consumer welfare standard, the Chicago School, Robert Bork creates this standard. Nobody anticipated e-commerce. Nobody anticipated where we would be today. And so the courts have all this precedent, and they have to, They have to abide by, respect the precedent that is there. Well, now the economy has changed to such a degree that Congress needs to step up and update the law. And that's one of the things that we don't like to do, because we make enemies when we do that, and we lose votes when we do that. I mean, these companies, in 1 month, they spent $36 million in members' districts saying what terrible bills my bills were. They didn't mention me by name, thankfully, but yeah, it's a very difficult job to update laws that have been around for a long time that have judicial precedent that is important. But it's also our job. That's what Article 1 is all about of the Constitution. We should be legislating, not giving the courts that job. And so I think that the bills that we're going to talk about, or that are in the book and that have been in Congress, are the kinds of bills that create the competitions that's necessary to update the law and where we are.
I agree with you. And right before we get to the bills, I do want to have you do my work for me and sort of let me know, what is your vision of how conservatives should look at antitrust going forward? Because we shy away from a lot of these questions. We tend to apply old frameworks to what I think are brand new issues. People would disagree, but I don't think anybody can not say that the world is shifting prodigiously given the rise of these new companies and, frankly, what they're visiting upon the American people. So how should a conservative then think about antitrust? And your package of bills got passed in the Omni. We at Heritage Action supported those 3 bills, the merger filing fee under the Merger Filing Fee Modernization Act. So can you sort of give us an outline with how you see the conservative antitrust future?
Sure. As Kevin said, Kevin is a free market guy, but he's in favor of updating these laws. And I'm sure you're a free market person. I'm a free market person. I apply that principle to just about everywhere. But if you don't have a market, you can't have a free market. And when Google controls 94% of the searches, online searches in this country, you don't have a free market. And if Google decides they like Joe Biden and they don't like Donald Trump, they'll do just what they did in June of 2020 and suppress all the positive stories on Donald Trump and emphasize the negative stories on Donald Trump and do the opposite with Joe Biden. They affect the outcome of elections because there is no free market. So we've got to deal with the competition issue first, and then we get to the marketplace of ideas, which is these companies. I don't really care if the Washington Post says something bad about me. They do, I'm fortunate that they do once a week because that means I'm relevant, but they do at least once a month. And the reality is that the Washington Times or the Washington Examiner or the New York Post can rebut that and say something nice about the issue for me. We don't care in newspapers because we have competition if a newspaper looks slanted. We don't care with cable news if a cable news channel looks slanted because we have Fox and Newsmax and others out there. And so the idea that Google can dominate in the way it dominates is what's so dangerous about where we are right now.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to talk about the NC State study that found that the majority of conservative candidates, their emails went to spam, whereas Democratic candidates, were largely left alone in the 2020 election cycle. And to really put a finer point on, when we say election interference and political outcomes we think have been tampered with by the actions of these companies, there's actual polling to indicate that is true. Even, 52% of likely voters directly after the election said because of information that was suppressed, that constitutes election interference. 1 in 6 Biden voters, again, because social media companies directly suppressed certain stories, they said they would have changed their votes. These are polls. There's additional ones as well. So we do know that there are political implications for what these tech companies do, especially when it's intensifying during election cycles. Again, before we get to solutions, I can't help myself, the Twitter files. So a lot of what people have complained about is certain people call it jawboning, the government sort of nudging social media companies to do things. We've seen with the Twitter files and these actual documents to indicate that the government was effectively strong-arming these, especially Twitter, but we know this is happening, on my old place of business at Facebook, probably happening in Google, YouTube-wise, et cetera. So what would you say to people who now are saying, okay, this might be a First Amendment violation when you have the government telling companies to police the speech of Americans, and particular Americans at that?
Yeah, I think anytime you've got state action, you're looking at First Amendment issues. And I think that it's clear from what Elon Musk has released that, especially in the COVID area, the government was trying to suppress certain ideas. Berenson at the New York Times is a perfect example of that. And there are many others. I talk about in the book how Rand Paul was treated on social media. Now, you've got a United States senator engaged in a debate with an executive official, Dr. Fauci, and for some reason that was dangerous to the American public to hear. Not just a United States senator, but a medical doctor engaged in this debate. So it got to the point of being ridiculous because the government was involved in it. And I think there are other theories that are floating around in the court system right now on how you can approach this issue and try to most of us, our instinct is to say, well, it's a private company. Who cares? It's their business, their stockholders, their board of directors. They'll decide what is good speech, what is bad speech. And the judicial precedent out there suggests otherwise, that railroads have been treated a certain way because they got a government benefit, not even government direction, but just a government benefit. And so I think that we're going to be seeing those theories come forward. But again, it sort of avoids the Article 1 reality that we should be doing the job and not leaving it up to the courts to create something over the next 30 years.
Speaking of Congress doing their jobs, House.
We did a great job with the speakers, right?
yeah, that was seamless, easy.
Just what McCarthy thought it was going to be.
Yes, a little humility is good for everyone, I guess. So when it comes to House, Republicans got it. One of your big jobs, oversight. Investigations. Do you think that anyone will face consequences for what happened with the Twitter files actually revealed?
Oh, I do. I think that both judiciary under antitrust as well as E&C with Section 230 will be looking at the not just the actions of Twitter, but all the social media companies. I think there, we have Elon Musk in there trying to do the right thing. I think for the right reasons. We don't have somebody at Facebook. We don't have somebody at Amazon, Apple, Google. But that's where Congress should be coming in and making sure that we subpoena issues. I mean, when Facebook bought Instagram, we've got emails between Zuckerberg and another person saying, we can't let this happen. They'll compete with us if we don't buy them. That's pretty good evidence. I'm sure that Paxton in Texas appreciates emails like that, but our job is to make sure the public knows about the dangers of what these companies are doing in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think that's very underreported. You'll have the guys at the All In podcast. They'll give some information about the inner workings of Silicon Valley, and sort of what they call, and what I found to be true when I was there, was it's an open secret that these companies they'll acquire smaller ones, innovative ones, just to kill them. They'll look at engineers who are really, really good, these programmers who are flying, and they'll put them in a corner to color so they can't create the new business that effectively would disrupt their own, or at least cut into their momentum. I think that's harmful, frankly, to national security. And you have a decent background in national security, and how are we going to compete at the world stage? We talked about China before, but if Silicon Valley is not necessarily, if they're not the engines of innovation that they claim to be, and really they're squelching these new entrants and these smaller competitors, how are we going to compete with China when Silicon Valley is acting the way that it does?
Well, it's a great question because we are not going to have lower labor costs than China. And we are not going to have lower energy costs with our energy regulations that are being put in place. We're not going to have lower energy costs. And if you look at all of the different costs, we're going to have higher costs to manufacture and create in this country than China. The one thing that we can do better than anybody in the world is innovate. And if we allow a few companies to crush it's a good word, to crush innovation.
Crushed everyone? Available outside?
It will really stifle our competitiveness in the world economy. And so we know that when Amazon, when a product is selling really well on Amazon, the Amazon folks take notice and they go out and they duplicate the product and then they start to sell it. Well, the investment in that original product dries up immediately because everybody knows that if Amazon has a product, It's going to put its product at the top of the page and its competitor on page 3, and it's going to crush its competitor. And so the marketplace reacts to these monopolies in a way that we don't want as free market advocates.
And I think there's an analogy here when you look at the greater landscape, and we all know the middle class is being crushed right now, given everything that's happening coming down from the Biden administration. You know, when you have a government seeking to regulate, it has to be done in a way I think that is precise and that is good. You have good and precise legislative fixes in your book. Can you talk about some of those? And you don't necessarily have to rank them, but I'll ask you which one you think is most important later.
So whatever Mike Lee likes, I like.
Same.
And Mike doesn't like all the legislative fixes in there, but there's one that I think is really important, and that is Google dominates ad sales, it dominates ad buys, and it bought the ad tech, which controls the marketplace for sales and buys. If that isn't a monopoly, I don't know what is. And so basically, in the Texas suit alleges that Google and Facebook entered into an agreement.
Yes.
That's something that the courts have to, and they'll have to prove. I'm not suggesting that I know any information that that's true or not, but the bill that Mike has introduced in the Senate and I've introduced in the House on that allows Google to continue to work on one of the 3 sides, but not all 3 sides.
Yep.
The same with Facebook. Now, a small company can work on all 3 sides if it can possibly compete in that marketplace, but it would basically restrict Google's activities in that selling, buying marketplace of ads. So I think that is one of the most important bills, because Google is really the I don't want to use the word evil, but I will. It is the company that has the greatest threat to speech, in my opinion, in the market. I think Facebook eventually will get competitors like TikTok and others, Instagram. I think that Apple will have its competition. Amazon is a fascinating company because its retail side doesn't make money. It's subsidized by the web service side. The web service side makes up most. I don't know if it's most, but a huge portion of its money by government contracts. So there are answers to some of the other companies, but Google really is dangerous, and that's why I think that ad tech bill is the most important.
Okay, so you would say Google is probably the worst offender when it comes to all of this.
I think it is, and look, I give these folks credit. They're geniuses. You know, they saw something that the rest of us didn't see, or we would have been, launching ourselves up to the moon. They are able to dominate in an area. So I'm not sure that they are bad. They're just taking advantage of something to an extent. And what's ironic is they started these companies in their garage. I mean, literally, Bezos had books selling out of his garage. And the next person that wants to start a business in the garage won't be able to because they'll be crushed by these companies. So I think that is the most important bill. There are other bills. Senator Blackburn has a bill on apps and making sure, the App Store charges a 30% surcharge if you compete with their product. So they have Apple Music and you have Spotify. Spotify has to pay a 30% surcharge. So to not discriminate in that area would allow more competition also.
I would like to get your take on, I think one of the things that I hear the most when we go out to states, our tech team will testify at state legislatures, we'll talk to a lot of just regular Americans on the ground. And number one, the first thing they say is, yes, big tech censorship. We know we're being censored. We don't know exactly how. We can't prove it. Elon Musk has given us some window into how it's done. What I don't think most of Americans understand is a lot of these companies live and die by the internal tools that they're consistently building on a day-to-day basis and tweaking. And sometimes that has the effect accidentally of suppressing certain things. Sometimes it's very deliberate. But the second thing I always hear is our kids. What are we going to do about the effect that these companies, these devices have on our children? I know there's a couple legislative proposals out there, but what is your take on, number one, what it's doing to our society and our next generation of citizens? I think there's a civic aspect here. And then number two, just the deleterious effects on, as conservatives, we don't gripe too much about mental health. We're tough and we rub some dirt in it and that's how it works. But at the same time, we can't deny that these issues are manifesting at hospitals, girls, verbal tics when they look at TikTok, et cetera. What is your take on, number one, the civic impact, potential civic impact, and number two, what it's doing to, frankly, the health of our children and especially our young ladies?
It's terrible. And again, the answer is to give parents choices. The answer is back in competition. But we know that Instagram recognized that there was body shaming go on. There was depression among teenage girls. There was a higher suicide rate among teenage girls. And they doubled down. They didn't just say, we've got to deal with this issue. They decided they were going to start marketing to a younger group of young ladies, of girls. And so, and again, there's a profit motive. I get the profit motive, but at some point, you've got to hold companies responsible for that kind of action so that there isn't a profit in making those decisions. But I get on the elevator, and I'm looking at a lot of young people here actually, but I get on the elevator in the Capitol, and every kid is like this. And so I am just an obnoxious person by habit. And so I always say, good morning, how are you? Isn't it beautiful out today? In Colorado, we have sun, but this is a really great sky here in D.C. I love gray. It's my favorite color. And they look at me like, you're disturbing me. I was on my account. But yeah, the addiction is just devastating because we lose the ability to actually interact and have that most basic. I think we learned during COVID that when you isolate people, we have really bad social outcomes. And I worry about that. And I don't blame social media. Again, I want parents to be able to say, you're not going on Instagram. You're going on XYZ because XYZ only has shots from the shoulders up and you're not going to be body shamed as much or whatever the answer is. But when Instagram buys everybody and sticks them on the shelf so they don't have competition, we end up with problems.
I completely agree. And I think generally it's something that we're going to have to grapple with for many, many years to come. So thank you for doing the hard work. But could you give us the inside scoop into, frankly, what Republicans can do about all of this? Because we know that there's been a lot of contentiousness about Section 230 reform, OAMA, as we talked about, even the Kids Online Safety Act, the data privacy and surveillance bills that are coming out. You know, tell us about the art of the possible from where you're sitting, because frankly, you know, we see a lot of fighting from our end. We're giving our policy recommendations. We're trying to give people the best ideas, but we don't know what's actually going to happen and what can happen. You have clearly a much better vantage. We have the luxury of, you know, spitting good ideas out, and, you know, you guys do the work and the implementing. So can you tell us what the implementing could actually look like?
Sure, but let me back up, and let's blame the Democrats a little bit here.
Easy day.
You know, we had good bills, we had good hearings, we had good investigations, we put good information out there, and we built a strong coalition. And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer didn't let anything go forward. They let a bill of basically 3 procedural issues go forward, but the substantive bills didn't move. If you look at what the Democrats and you look at what these companies have done, it's very typical to run commercials in districts. Okay, we get that. And it's typical to give $5,000 checks out from PACs to people. We get that. What's unusual is the number of children of members who are employed by these companies. That's what blows you away with these companies. Zoe Lofgren's daughter works for Amazon. Zoe Lofgren introduced, every single time we had that 29-hour hearing, Zoe Lofgren was introducing poison pill amendments to try to kill those bills, proudly. You know, she sits down at Thanksgiving dinner with Jeff Bezos' mouthpiece. And so that's dangerous. Nancy Pelosi's husband invests in these companies the week before our hearing, and it just so happens that Steny Hoyer, the majority leader, stands up the day or 2 or 3 days after our hearing when these bills are all put out, because I don't think they thought we were going to pass most of these bills, but when these bills passed the Judiciary Committee, Steny Hoyer says they're not ready for the floor. The stock price goes up. He made about $2.5 million off of his investment in some of these tech companies that were under investigation. So some of the progressives, to their credit, said, we can't allow members to invest in individual stocks. Nancy Pelosi was opposed to that. I wonder why. And then you got Chuck Schumer, 2 daughters working for tech companies, 2 daughters. So, I mean, his Thanksgiving dinner is really, he's got a big headache because Facebook and Apple or whoever they work for, you know, they may not agree on everything. So now you've got real competition going on at his Thanksgiving dinner. But yeah, the idea that these companies can come in and influence policy because they have so much money is frightening. And so let's just put that in perspective. The Democrats had the White House, the Senate, and the House, and they did nothing to increase competition in this area. What they ultimately want to do, which is the scary thing, and anybody who's on the fence on this issue should keep this in mind, what they ultimately want to do is they want a government agency to decide what kind of speech is appropriate on the internet. And if you think that's a good idea, then you think we should do nothing in this area and just let the courts and the marketplace take care of it. It scares the heck out of me to think that we're going to have some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. decide this is appropriate for the market, for the internet. But what I think is possible in the House, one of the reasons I wrote this book, the main reason I wrote this book, is to make sure that we get, thank you, that we get the word out on this issue. And I want to go around the country and speak on this issue and make sure people understand the threat that big tech poses to speech in America. And my job is to convince Republicans that we need to do something, that we can't sit back and just wait because the outcomes are going to be really bad for us if we do. We won't win a presidential election if Zuckerberg is spending $400 million in presidential elections and Google is suppressing conservative ideas in presidential elections. We can't overcome that burden, even with Sleepy Joe. It just is almost impossible to get that done. So I think it is incumbent on me and incumbent on other Republicans to get on board and figure out how to get this done. Now, it doesn't mean every bill is going to pass, but some of these bills have to pass in the next 2 years. How are we going to pass Schumer and his daughters? I don't know.
Well, in the meantime, is there anything, what can we do? What can the people in this room do? What can people in your district do? What can those of us at the grassroots who, you know, we will try to influence policy within the companies themselves, like you said, more user control, more choices, you know, looking at algorithmic impacts and having them tweak that. I think that's important for the companies top down to work on these issues too. But what can American citizens do in the meantime while we're waiting for some legislative action out of the Hill?
Yeah, so one of the reasons these companies are so powerful is because they are really good. Yeah. You know, Google has the best search engine, but that doesn't mean you can't spend a little more time and be a little more patient and use a different search engine. It doesn't mean you can't go into your closet today and say, oh, we're low on toilet paper. I'll go to the store, or I'll order something that will be here in a week as opposed to next day delivery with Amazon. You actually can have an impact on the marketplace with your personal choices. And one of the things I advocate for in this book is it's up to you. It's up to you to contact your congressman and say, have you thought about these bills? Have you thought about how dangerous big tech is? I can't tell you how many people I talked to, my colleagues, Republican colleagues, and I said, you know, this is really dangerous. Amazon Video is not allowing these movies on and on and on. And they said, yeah, but Ken, I have an Amazon facility in my district. Yeah. No kidding. I thought you were a United States congressman. I didn't realize that you were just a congressman for Amazon. And so we have challenges with our side, but citizens can impact that. If congressmen feel like it's going to cause me more pain than pleasure, they will do what Pavlov said.
That makes sense to me, at least. Last thing before we go to Q&A, what is the one thing that
I thought this was Q&A, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I mean, basically. When the audience needs to get a voice, of course, what is the one thing that you think could happen with regard to the general big tech problem in the 118th Congress?
Well, I hope that the ad tech bill gets passed. That's what I'm hoping. I think that will have an impact. And here's one of the things that is also happening. I talked about how Congress has the Article 1 responsibility to legislate. The courts aren't stupid. Yeah. They are listening. And the more we bring out, the more Elon Musk brings out, but the more we bring out evidence and the more we're able to influence public opinion, the courts are going to move on the consumer welfare standard in a way that will update it to what we're looking at. So I think one of the most important things we do is to continue to inform and educate and to make sure that the courts see that we get it And we may have some issues in getting to 218 in the House and getting to 60 in the Senate, but we're going to get there. And if there are things that you can see that these companies have done that are anti-competitive, you should make sure that you apply the standards under the law, but you update those in a way that makes the marketplace more competitive.
Awesome. All right. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So, Will, if you want to pick one.
Peter Semmel with MLEX. My question is, you've just authored a book on antitrust on big tech. You have Amy Klobuchar, who has her book on antitrust. How close will you be working with your counterpart in the Senate, Klobuchar, to get these deals, get these laws into action? And what are your plans for the hearings in the upcoming Congress? And will you be working together to make sure that you have the same subject matter on both the Senate and the House side? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So every bill we introduced in the House, I think, had a companion bill in the Senate. So I work primarily with Mike Lee, but Mike works very closely with Amy. I talk to Amy, I don't want to say on a regular basis, but I talk to Amy more than occasionally about these bills. And it's obvious that it's bipartisan. David Cicilline from Rhode Island and I worked very closely on this. Mike and Amy worked very closely on it. And so it is also bicameral. We are not introducing bills and not messaging in the House in a way that's inconsistent in the Senate. So I think that if the problem has always been leadership. It hasn't been, there is great support on the Judiciary Committee. Chuck Grassley is amazing on this issue and has really pushed it. I know he's, I think, focusing more on budget than Judiciary this next year, but I think that the bicameral nature of this is as strong as any effort has been in at least my 8 years in Congress.
Good question. Jake, do you want to take one from this side?
Hello, Congressman. Bartlett Clellan with Innovation Economy Institute. First of all, thank you for your leadership during the leadership debate. I saw your call that McCarthy needed to make a deal or get out of the way, and I thought that was exactly right. We needed a third person in line for the presidency, so thank you. I will say, honestly, a quick moment, I'm a little aghast at throwing people's kids under the bus. As a longtime social conservative and family values guy, I would never attack someone else's kids. I think we can probably rise above that.
You're talking about what I said about
I would never throw the military under the bus because of your son or business under the bus because of your daughter. So you might think on that a moment. But my real question is about your expression of following Mike Lee. I also love Mike Lee. He has a bill that would, and you're right, the legislature needs to step up in a lot of places. And one of those, I think, is in protecting the consumer welfare standard in antitrust. So are you going to sign on to his, or maybe you're already on, whatever the companion might be in the House, the bill that would enshrine that in antitrust law?
So Mike and I have worked, yes is the answer to your question, the short answer. The definition of the consumer welfare standard is what is at play right here, and how broad it is to make sure that we're not protecting inefficient industries, but we are promoting competition. And so I have worked with Mike on that issue, and I'm on board with Mike in making sure that the consumer welfare standard is part of the analysis. It's broader than what some courts have interpreted and what the FTC in the past has hamstrung themselves with, which is just basically a price analysis. We have to make sure it's broader than that, given the nature of e-commerce and social media. But it is something that I am absolutely on board with Mike on.
Hello, Georgiana Constantine Park with CNS News. I wonder if the problem hasn't been wrongly identified. Perhaps the problem is not big tech, but big government. Because we're talking about crony capitalism, we know that if monopolies start in a true free market, they don't really have a chance to remain monopolies because there are no barriers to entry, and other companies will come and be more profitable and create this competition that we're talking about and that is so important. And so I wonder if the real problem is in big government and the profitability of left-wing ideology. And if that is a problem, and I think it is, some of the things coming from the left wing nowadays would make Orwell blush. What are Republicans doing about it? What is the solution? And are they doing anything about it?
Well, I agree with you. The reason these companies were really blossoming, I guess, I don't think I think of that as a positive term. I don't mean it as a positive term, but they grew to such an extent so quickly during the Obama administration. First of all, President Obama was the darling of Silicon Valley. You know, he was the first president that sort of we look at JFK as this telegenic president at the time when television was taking over, and Obama was this president who took advantage of social media so well. And so he brought in a lot of people from Silicon Valley and populated a lot of his agencies with those people, and they turned a blind eye to a lot of these mergers. If some of these mergers hadn't occurred, Instagram would be a great competitor to Facebook. Instead, they are controlled by Facebook, owned by Facebook, or Meta, or whatever they call the company now. But so I think that government has played a serious role in allowing the problem to become as great as it is right now. I also think that the government uses these companies in a way that benefits leaders in government. They've done it in COVID. They've done it with other issues. So I think that the concern about big government and not big media, but big tech in this case, is an absolutely valid concern and should be investigated. One of the issues we have in Congress is we have such split jurisdiction in an area like this that we almost need a special committee. And I don't know whether Kevin's doing that or not doing that. I should say Speaker McCarthy. But it is something that I think should be considered because ENC and Judiciary need to work together to address this issue.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions. Up here, Jake? Or,
no, I just
wanna...
saw someone's hand in the back for a while.
But... Oh, yeah. We'll do that.
Hey, thank you, Congressman, so much. Rick Van from the Coalition for App Fairness. Kara, we loved your paper on big tech's red herring and the national security arguments that they've been using to fight against competition laws, not only in the United States, but in Europe, the UK, and around the world. So, Congressman, I was just wondering if you could speak to some of these arguments that they use that, by allowing more competition in the tech space, that somehow this would hurt our national security, when in fact, as Kara has pointed out, that it really could advance U.S. national security and interest.
She's right.
I'll take it. We'll end here. Let's go.
No, I think that it's clear that they go out and they pay someone $1 million. They get an op-ed in a news, Washington Post or something, and they say, "Oh, the big bad Chinese, they're going to come and they're going to take over the world if we actually allow competition in the marketplace." We know that competition is what allows innovation, what spurs innovation. It's a profit motive. If you can't get your company off the ground because you can't get investors because Amazon's going to crush you, then we aren't going to have innovation in a lot of these areas. So clearly a red herring, clearly an issue that, I think Mike Lee wrote about it also, and others have written about. This is just ridiculous. Don't pay attention to this argument that these companies, and by the way, I've got a chapter entitled Hypocrisy. These companies go into China and they work with the Chinese. Google works with the Chinese on a search engine that will suppress everything that the Communist Party doesn't want the Chinese people to see, and then refuses to work with our Department of Defense because they're offended that somehow empowering our military with a visor, artificial intelligence visor that helps our military and protects our soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors is pro-war and offends their sensibilities. They love China because they can and they've learned a lot from how the Chinese censor their people and how these companies want to censor our people.
Last question?
Yeah, Congressman, we had a live stream question that dovetails nicely with that about the brain drain that happens from elite universities to 5 or 6 big tech companies when perhaps in the 40s and 50s they would have gone to build key national security technology. Can you talk about how pernicious that effect is for young people who want to be software engineers or engineers of other types and are offered $300,000 out of college by Facebook and Google, whereas some national security companies that are just starting can't pay that same check?
Sure. Well, I think it's a great point, although I have to tell you, to suggest that there is any kind of brain drain at major universities when I've seen their woke curriculum and everything else, it's hard for me to believe there's much brain power at some of these universities when we see critical race theory and other ideological agendas being pushed there. But I do think that these companies, as Kara said earlier, they identify great engineers at a competitor and just offer them ridiculous money to come over. They can be sitting and staring at a wall, but they're not going to allow their competitor to get a foot up with really good talent. And they're doing the same thing in these universities. They're taking a ton of great people and using them in a way that promotes what they've got. But again, if we've got true competition, we've got other companies making money and seeing profits, they can go compete. I don't mind anybody making $300,000 out of college. It's twice my salary, but it doesn't offend me at all that they're one day out of college making that much money. But I do think that with competition, hopefully we increase salaries and we give young students coming out of college the opportunity to work for a variety of good companies they can be proud of, companies that aren't body shaming, companies that aren't cheating in the marketplace, companies that are making American products and America stronger.
All right, so we are at time, but sir, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything you want to leave everyone with before we tell them to go get their book signed?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, and Kara, thank you for putting this together on short notice. And I know you have family to watch, and we are praying for you and your family today. I just would encourage everyone to get involved. It is frustrating to see people anywhere just come up to me and say, I really feel strongly. You're right. Well, thanks. End of conversation.
Yeah.
Be part of this solution. And I'm not suggesting that I've got the whole answer or even a small part of the answer, but if we don't deal with big tech very soon, we're going to have a big problem. Thank you.
Completely agree. Thank you for coming. And the senator or the congressman will be outside to sign books as after this. So pick up your copy just outside the auditorium here. And thank you very much for coming, everyone online and here.